Andrea Yates, Susan Smith, Darla Routier. Three of the more infamous names of mothers who were convicted of murdering their children. However, this heinous, unthinkable act is not nearly as rare as society would like to believe it is, and it certainly is not a 21st century phenomenon. Women who have killed their children have been recorded as far back as 38 AD and have been an area of study since the 1800s. This is the case of Deanna Laney, and you are listening to Shades of Murder. Please be forewarned that each episode contains specific and at times very graphic and disturbing details of the case and may not be intended for all audiences. This is a special warning for those who are extra sensitive to abuse or violence committed against children. At 11:30 p.m. on Friday, May 11, 2003, in Tyler, Texas, 39-year-old Deanna Laney arose quietly from her bed. Her husband was in a deep sleep, and so were her 3 small children. Her mission had been mapped out for weeks, and she was committed to following his plan. She breathed in and out deeply, touching the cross necklace at her throat, knowing she had been divinely chosen to do God's work. Deanna first crept into the baby's room, where 14-month-old Aaron lay peacefully asleep in his crib. She had to get the youngest one over first. Then all of a sudden, the door slowly opened. Deanna was startled to see her half-asleep husband, but remained calm and smiled gently at him as he entered the baby's room. She reassured him that everything was fine, told him some lie about why she was in there, and ushered him to go back to bed. Deanna waited until she could hear her husband sleeping through the bedroom door, then returned to complete the first part of her mission. Lifting a stone above her head, she slammed it down with all of her might onto her infant's skull. Aaron's tiny head immediately began to swell and bleed. She lifted the stone again for a second strike, but instead Deanna dropped it to the ground, feeling defeated by the heavy task before her. Deanna prayed to God to please finish off her baby for her, because she did not have the strength to do what he asked of her. Within minutes, she left her unconscious infant lying on the floor, bleeding near his crib, and went to her son, Luke's room. Grabbing Luke by the ankles, Deanna dragged her 6-year-old son from his bed and outside to the front yard. There she lifted a large stone and hit him over the head with it multiple times. The little boy began to convulse and bleed out onto the lawn. Deanna lifted the stone again and placed it upon the little boy's chest. She trembled at the sight of her small son's breath fading in front of her, but her faith kept her going. Deanna could not watch him die any longer. As she looked up into the night sky, lightning struck, and she knew her son Luke was now gone. Then she returned to the house and lured her older son, 8-year-old Joshua, out to the front yard. The little boy panicked in fear as he saw his younger brother Luke lying dead with a rock on his chest on the grass. Deanna then forced her eldest son to lie down next to his dead little brother. She picked up an even larger stone and struck him over and over with it until he was dead. Hopefully, she thought, the angel of the Lord would be satisfied with her sacrifices and let her be by his side when the end of days on earth came. Deanna walked back into the house and calmly called 911. She waited for further instructions from God on what next she should do, but nothing ever came. This is the call the 911 operator in Tyler, Texas received that early morning, one day before Mother's Day.
I just killed my boy. What is your address? 13664 Arizona Drive. Where are your boys at? They're outside. Outside where now? In the front yard. What did you use?
when the police arrived at the scene of the multiple child homicides. The mother of 3 appeared in front of them wearing clothes soaked in the blood of her 3 children. The woman did not speak a word, and she showed zero emotion. Her face was splattered with the blood of her sons. There were no tears or signs of remorse. Officers at the scene reported that a man, believed to be the father of the 3 sons, was screaming at her, "What have you done? What have you done to our boys?" Investigators were horrified by the scene before them. Lying in the front yard were 2 small boys wearing only their underwear. Their heads were bashed in, and they had stones placed upon their chests. When officers entered the home, they saw an infant, its head also bludgeoned with a stone lying near its crib. The 2 boys were dead, but the baby miraculously was still breathing. Deanna Laney was placed under arrest and taken into custody for the murders of her 2 children, 6-year-old Luke and 8-year-old Joshua, and the attempted murder of her 14-month-old infant Aaron. Deanna Laney was placed under arrest and taken into custody for the murders of her 2 children, 6-year-old Luke and 8-year-old Joshua, and the attempted murder of her 14-month-old infant Aaron. The wife and mother of 3 now faced 2 counts of capital murder for lapidation, which is stoning. She did not shed a tear for her dead children. She showed no signs of feeling anything at all. Deanna Laney would reveal to psychiatrists how she had been suffering from hallucinations for the last 4 years, but she had never told anyone about them. After the birth of her youngest child, Aaron, her delusions, depression, and feelings of detachment began to escalate. Deanna Laney conveyed to psychiatrists that she had been told that the end of days was near, and that as a devoutly Christian woman, it was up to her to prove her loyalty to God. She had to demonstrate her loyalty and utter devotion to Him by killing her children. Deanna Laney spoke of how the angel of the Lord had instructed her to murder her sons because she was the chosen one and would be saved. According to Deanna Laney, God appeared to her on countless occasions. He told her that if she kept resisting doing what was asked of her, she would have to kill her sons in increasingly more violent ways. She spoke of how the Lord had told her that He wanted her to strangle or stab her boys to death, but she struggled with having to kill them in such a brutal fashion. Then one day, while she was in the front yard having another conversation with God about her mission, Deanna suddenly tripped over a stone. It was the sign she was praying for, and she knew that killing her children by stoning them to death was the answer. The United States ranks number 1 in child homicide among developed nations, with approximately 500 incidents a year. This number is likely significantly higher due to inaccurate record keeping and murders that appear to be accidental, such as those involving child neglect or sudden-infant death syndrome. Children are more likely to be killed by their parents than by any other offender. As discussed in an earlier episode, approximately 90% of the perpetrators of child homicide are their biological parents, and fathers and mothers commit the killings in roughly equal portions. Whereas the murder of infants and young children commonly involve the use of more personal weapons, such as being beaten to death by a parent's hands or feet, when older children are killed, the brutality continues to increase as they age. In the United States, women comprise 43% of the perpetrators of child homicide under the age of 6 years old. In 2001, the same year when Andrea Yates drowned her 5 children, the U.S. Department of Justice released a report by trauma experts on maternal filicide. Their research revealed that women's victims are predominantly under the age of 6 years old. Mothers who murder their children are also way more likely to be labeled as mentally ill than fathers who commit the same act. This is likely due to societal expectations for women to be loving, gentle, and kind mothers. When women fail to meet this expectation and their behavior goes against the grain of motherhood, society attempts to explain and understand their vile actions through the lens of mental illness. William Reed, MD, MPH, a forensic psychiatry consultant and former commissioner of mental health in Texas, was appointed by the court to evaluate Deanna Laney's mental state at the time of the murder of her children. He placed her on antipsychotic medication shortly after the killings, and he was reported as witnessing a huge difference in her only several weeks later. Deanna Laney had been so wrapped up in her belief that she had done what God wanted her to do, that it prevented her from doubting her actions. At the time, she expressed no sense of loss, remorse, or grief for killing her sons. Deanna Laney went from numb, emotionless, and delusional to a woman who finally began to grasp the monstrous crimes she had committed against her children. During Dr. Reed's interviews with Deanna Laney, it was revealed that she had been given what she described as urgings from God to murder her sons. Dr. Reed officially diagnosed Deanna Laney with grandiose-type delusional disorder, manifested by her extreme devotion to religion and her communications with God. This delusional disorder is characterized by feelings of invulnerability, egomania, and beliefs of grandeur, which have been structured and rearranged by the mind to piece together the fragmented personality. Her defense counsel decided to pursue a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. So what does this mean in a court of law? I have discussed this before, so I will be brief in its explanation. It is a defense which is an affirmative defense, meaning that it falls solely upon the defendant and their counsel to prove that they had a mental illness or disorder so severe at the time of the act that they were incapable of forming the criminal intent or mens rea, and therefore should not be found guilty of the crime. In a court of law, to receive this judgment by the jury, the mental disease or impairment must be shown to have successfully eliminated the concept of what is morally right and wrong to the defendant, and that any appreciation for their criminal behavior was incapable of being acknowledged. The McNaughton Rules is a set of criteria based on the concept that it is only morally justifiable to punish an offender who comprehends the immorality and criminality of their actions. If it can be demonstrated that someone's mental state lacks the criminal intention required to form mens rea, that person should not be subjected to criminal punishment. The rules are designed to determine whether or not a defendant was inflicted by a mental illness or impairment that prevented their ability to understand the criminal nature and wrongfulness of the offense. Specifically in the state of Texas, the insanity defense relies upon the fact of whether or not the defendant understood that their actions were wrong. It was suggested in her criminal trial that Deanna Laney's mental disorder was so extreme that it impaired her ability to understand that her actions were wrong. Philip Resnick, MD, who has studied maternal filicide in depth, was an expert witness for the defense. He pointed out how Deanna Laney had been known for being the perfect mother. Those in her life and community described her as a loving and kind woman who was completely devoted to her husband and their 3 children. She taught her sons from home and was an active and engaged member of the Pentecostal Church. He explained to the jury that when he interviewed Deanna Laney 6 days after attacking her kids, she still expressed no grief or regret because she believed her actions were right since they had come directly from God. She also firmly believed that if she refused to do God's bidding, she would be burning in hell. Deanna Laney truly believed that the murder of her children was the ultimate test of her faith in God, and in doing so, she had passed. She also held on to the belief that her sons would be resurrected, and waited for a week after they died for them to rise again. Park Dietz, the psychiatrist who was appointed by the prosecution, also agreed with the defense psychiatrist's assessment of Deanna Laney's mental health, and that she could not distinguish between right and wrong at the time she killed her sons. She also informed the court how the defendant had suffered from psychotic episodes 3 years prior. They were described as including delusions of reference, and olfactory hallucinations, which involve smelling things that don't exist. Deanna Laney also shared how she felt she was being choked, had feelings of overwhelming fear, and developed strange sleeping patterns. Yet nothing was ever done to address these psychotic episodes. Dr. Dietz told the court how some of her symptoms closely mirrored the experiences that other Pentecostal Christians have described. For those of you who are not familiar with this form of Christianity, Pentecostalism is a movement within Protestant Christianity that places its emphasis on the gifts of the Holy Spirit. These gifts include glossolalia, which is speaking in tongues, supernatural healings, and other extreme expressions of spiritual nature. It was mentioned that since the defendant was so completely immersed in her Pentecostal community, her symptoms and experiences of psychosis were difficult to distinguish from what others in her religion have described. The prosecuting attorney attempted to redirect the strong evidence that was presented by all 4 of the psychiatrists and mental health experts, including that of the states. He addressed the jury, declaring to them that they alone decide the issue of sanity, despite what a panel of experts may believe. He even questioned the state's expert about how Deanna Laney did not understand right from wrong when she resisted God's calling and hesitated to kill her children. Dr. Dietz claimed that the defendant did not want to harm her sons, that she loved them. They were, as she called them, her precious boys. But she felt the decision was out of her hands. Deanna Laney struggled between obeying God's commands and what she desired, which was to raise and love her sons, not kill them. The jury was not swayed by the state, and they agreed with psychiatrists that Deanna Laney was legally insane when she committed the murders. She was found not guilty by reason of insanity and was sentenced to the Texas Department of Mental Health and Mental Retardation. Please note that this is the legal name of the facility. When a defendant receives a not guilty by reason of insanity decision, they are treated as long as they are deemed to be mentally ill and dangerous to themselves and or to society. The insanity defense is a valid legal defense and should exist to protect those from traditional incarceration who have no autonomy nor perception of wrongfulness over their own actions due to the debilitation of a mental disease or personality disorder. However, this criteria does not apply to the actions of Deanna Laney, nor her state of mind, as she was not ignorant to the harm she was inflicting upon her children. She was mentally in control over the steps she intentionally took to cause the death of her sons. So what is known about her sentencing? And why the jurors may have found her not guilty, despite the evidence that the killing of her children had been completely premeditated and planned out. It is first necessary to view her crime through the lens of gender, female criminality, and religion. There is a cultural bias in our society towards women who commit violent acts, especially when done against their children, which leads them to be commonly portrayed as being insane. This bias extends outward into the criminal justice system. More women are diagnosed with mental illness when committing violent crimes against their children and are penalized differently for this behavior. Women who commit violent crimes, especially in the various forms of filicide, are significantly more likely to be successful at avoiding criminal punishment, in particular any length of incarceration, by utilizing the insanity defense in court over attempts that are made by male offenders. Filicide is perceived as the response to a severe personality disruption, combined with the strains of parental responsibility, which culminates in the breakdown and hindrance of the psyche, releasing itself, and repressed rage. The murder of one's children by their mother goes against the grain of everything that our society associates with women and motherhood. These inherently feminine, kind, and loving traits that gender roles attach to women make the act of filicide so abhorrent that society tends to assign a mental illness to the female offender to process the occurrence of such an unfathomable criminal act. Some studies have found that when circumstances around the criminal event are perceived to be outside the control of the defendant, in particular a woman diagnosed with schizophrenia or another psychotic disorder, jurors are more likely to offer them leniency in their sentencing versus if there were no mitigating factors. The state of mind that comprised the defendant who was the most successful at pleading not guilty by reason of insanity were women with psychosis who had auditory hallucinations and delusions, in particular when they believed the murders must be carried out for the divine salvation of the child or the world. In the case of Deanna Laney, who on the stand during her trial said that she could not finish killing her baby and that God would have to take over the act, the defendant acknowledged that she had awareness of her actions. She consciously chose to stop bashing in her 14-month-old baby's head. Yet her delusions led her to believe that since God told her she must kill her kids since the end of the world was coming, their murders were justified. If losing control over one's impulses can be a temporary state of mental incapacity due to the presence of a mental illness, then the actions of Deanna Laney do not meet the legal requirement because of her withdrawal of conduct towards her youngest child. Deanna Laney believed that God guided her to kill her sons for a higher purpose that she did not necessarily understand, yet her religious conviction blindly followed these orders instead of protecting her children. Since these tragic deaths were committed for the sake of her soul being saved and not for the salvation of her children, as defined by altruism, the actions of Deanna Laney do not meet this description. P.J. Resnick, who is a longtime expert on the subject, established the first set of typologies that can help to understand the motivations of maternal filicide. Mothers who kill their children have been categorized into several typologies, including altruistic, acutely psychotic, accidental, unwanted child, or spousal revenge. The one that would signify the motivations and actions of Deanna Laney would be acutely psychotic filicide. This typology involves the circumstances where the parent holds no motive that can be explained or comprehended. This includes mothers who murder their children under the influence or direction of hallucinatory commands, a state of delirium, or another neurological disorder, such as epilepsy. This typology includes mothers who murder their children under religious delusion. It was later revealed in interviews with psychiatrists that Deanna Laney believed that Andrea Yates, yes, that Andrea Yates, who murdered all 5 of her young children by drowning them, played an integral role in her own mission. She allegedly confessed to the psychiatrist that she believed that she and Andrea would be the final witnesses to the end of days. I find it very interesting how Deanna Laney felt connected to Andrea Yates through their religious beliefs and the sacrifice of their children to God. It is not a coincidence that these 2 extremely religious mothers killed their children. How ironic it is that they got to spend some time together at the Texas State Hospital. I can only imagine the conversations these 2 mothers had. There have been studies conducted on the correlation between religion, psychosis, and filicide. There is a commonality among women who commit filicide who have multiple children, who hold religiously fanatic belief systems, and who suffer from postpartum depression. Deanna Laney is only one example of this dangerous combination. In the research article, "He Made Me Do It," Christianity and Maternal Filicide in Texas by Lisa M. Nichols. It analyzed the acts of filicide committed through the lens of the gender oppression, established by Christianity and reinforced by the patriarchy. 4 women who killed their children in Texas were studied. Strict Western religion is based upon the structure of male authority and female obedience, and all 4 of these mothers lived by these rules. In particular, in the southern states, the concept of the apocalypse, one's faith being tested, the end of days, heaven and hell, and needing to be an obedient, good Christian woman are popular themes. Deanna Laney, in addition to Andrea Yates, Dina Schlosser, and Audie Sanchez, all shared similar backgrounds and motivations for their acts of filicide. Risk factors included that all of these offenders experienced religious delusions, extreme isolation, and they were all stay-at-home mothers. All 4 of them had experiences and held conversations with God, and at least to some extent, their delusions were normalized within the extreme belief system of their religion. Except for Sanchez, who declared it was Satan who directed her to kill her child. Laney, Yates, and Schlosser all specified that they were commanded orders by God as a test of their absolute faith in him. For Deanna Laney, she stated that to prove herself as a devout Christian woman, she had to obey God's orders to kill her children. Deanna Laney had told fellow members of her church that God had been speaking to her and told her that the end of days was near. These 3 women all were very isolated, bound by strict religious discipline, held traditional gender roles as stay-at-home mothers and wives, and felt it was their duty to obey the men in their lives, their husbands and God included, in addition to bearing multiple children. Treatment at a mental health facility usually involves a lengthier investment of time, rather than if the defendant has been found guilty and sent to prison as the alternative. A study across multiple states revealed that courts are more likely to release convicted felons than they are to free those who have been acquitted of the insanity defense. Statistics show that 84.7% are held for an extended period. 14.2% are released for community treatment, and only 1.1% are ever released free. Under state law in Texas, Deanna Laney was initially placed within a maximum security facility. Soon after, she was transferred to Kerrville State Hospital, which had lesser security and restrictions. When a defendant has been placed in a mental facility, their mental state is reviewed by a board every year. Deanna Laney was recommitted to the institution in both 2005 and 2006. However, it was realized that the Texas Department of Mental Health and Mental Retardation had been granting Deanna Laney day passes. This gave her the freedom to leave the facility without any supervision and go out with her parents to shop and have lunch for the day. When the state learned of this, they filed a motion asking for the trial court to review the propriety of the passes. The 2-day hearing resulted in the conclusion that the Texas Department of Mental Health did not hold the authority to grant her such privileges. Deanna Laney appealed their decision under question of jurisdiction. The courts essentially declared that they had jurisdiction over her for life, and that such privileges as passes and furloughs do not apply to someone convicted of being incompetent to stand trial, especially when they have committed such a violent crime as murdering their 2 children. Can you even imagine what is running through Deanna Laney's mind? That she is fighting the courts to have the right to go on a shopping excursion when she brutally murdered her 2 young sons and permanently disabled her infant. I mean, it makes you wonder, perhaps she is just evil and not so psychotic after all. This small victory for justice to prevent her from having these day trips with her parents would be unfortunately short-lived. In 2012, after only 8 years of mental health treatment and criminal confinement, under the recommendation of 4 different psychiatrists, Deanna Laney was released from the mental health facility. It was decided by these alleged psychiatric experts that this woman who savagely murdered her 6- and 8-year-old sons and permanently disabled her 14-month-old infant was no longer deemed a threat to herself or society. Her freedom is dependent upon the restrictions of her release, including no unsupervised contact with minors and frequent tests to ensure that she is taking her antipsychotics. These kinds of decisions make one feel hopeless toward the system. When a mother who kills her children, or any person who murders a child for that matter, is allowed to live their life freely in any capacity. In an exclusive interview with KLTV out of Smith County, Texas, the other victim of this tragedy, the father of these little boys, Keith Laney, shared his feelings on his ex-wife being released, as most of society felt and still feels. He is in shock that she is out, and he wishes there was a way to keep her in her facility for life. When Deanna Laney smashed her baby's head with a stone, she gave him permanent brain damage. This is something that Aaron will never recover from. His father, Keith Laney, expressed how Aaron is his greatest gift in life, his miracle son. But that each day his little boy struggles is a reminder of his former wife's horrendous crimes that were committed against him. At 10 years old, his father still has to place braces on his feet, feed him, brush his teeth, change his diaper every day. Deanna Laney not only murdered her 2 sons and destroyed the chance of her youngest ever being able to live a normal and healthy life, but she negatively impacted the life of her husband and countless others who cared about the family. I find it revolting that this person, this woman who ever dared to call herself a mother, is free now to live her life. The punishment she received, which ended up being 8 years in a mental institution, the same age as her oldest son Joshua was when she brutally murdered him, does not reflect justice, much less any definition of penance for her crime. The psychiatrist who decided to release her into society, even under the regulations of treatment and restrictions of her being alone with a minor, have made a neglectful and irresponsible error in judgment. I do have compassion, even empathy for those who suffer from such a severe mental illness that it can induce hallucinations and delusions to the extent that they harm, even murder someone else. Such individuals deserve to be protected and cared for with treatment to ensure that they no longer pose a threat to society. However, the only way to even remotely guarantee that is to keep them monitored at all times in a safe and secure mental health facility. Maybe some individuals can earn the right to a day pass, but this is all dependent upon the degree of their mental illness and the crimes they committed. Anyone capable of killing her children under the delusional guise that God directed her to do so, and chose to follow these hallucinogenic instructions over what she knew to be morally right, does not deserve to have rights or privileges like the rest of society. I will leave you with this puritanical quote regarding filicide. The Puritans believed all women who killed their babies violated what was taken to be the law of nature decreed by God. The women who killed their children, then they were by definition unnatural and monstrous, more hardened than the sea monsters who draw out their breasts and give such to their young ones. Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate each and every one of you, and I'm beyond thrilled to continue bringing you episodes. Until next time, stay safe. happening in the streets next door. Especially inside your own home.